Hey, good morning everyone, it's TractorMan 44 here. Hey, today we're going to work on the wife's '04 Mustang. It's an anniversary edition '04 Mustang convertible. It's a V6, everything standard, nothing crazy about it at all. But we've got an air conditioning problem. I think we've had it since '05 or '06. We bought it used with a few thousand miles on it from a one owner. And it's only driven sometimes in the summertime and not very often then, so it still has very little miles on it. But for the first time, the air conditioning system is not cooling. So after a while, you can feel it begin to cool down, so the refrigerant is going to have to be topped off. It's not a total leak, it's not totally empty, so I'm probably not going to, depending on what kind of pressure is in it, I'm probably not going to have to pressurize it with nitrogen and do a leak test or whatever like that. If it's just going to require a few ounces, we'll just top it off and be done with it. This thing should only take about 2 pounds of refrigerant anyway, maybe 2.5 pounds at the very most. So it doesn't take very much of a loss for it to get to the point to where it doesn't cool very well. So yeah, that's what we're going to do. When you open up the hood and you look under here, look at your compressor as though it's the actual heart of the system. The compressor, once it's energized and begins pumping the refrigerant, it takes the returning or low pressure refrigerant and builds the refrigerant into a high pressure gas. It sends it at that particular point to the condenser in the high pressure gas farm, so that in the condenser, through the fan blowing across it, will reject the heat, and as it rejects the heat, the high pressure gas or high pressure vapor will condense back into a liquid. So once it leaves the condenser, it's going to be a high pressure liquid. Once it's a high pressure liquid, it's ready to go to the other half of the circuit and start the refrigeration process again. So you think about it, you've got a high pressure liquid leaving the condenser. You want to make sure that the system is full enough so that all of the high pressure liquid coming out of the condenser totally fills that refrigerant line going down to be metered. Typically somewhere in that line would be a sight glass if the system is equipped with that. Chances are it's not going to be this day and time, but they used to have a sight glass in them. And a lot of commercial refrigeration and air conditioning systems do as well. But, to make a long story short, you'll actually have a high pressure port on that condenser or high pressure liquid leaving the condenser line right here. The high pressure port is an entirely different size fitting on the new R134A than it is on the suction or the low pressure side. So at any rate, you follow your high pressure liquid line and you'll see that it'll come over here and it'll go in through, you can't see it, but it'll go through a metering device and into what's called an evaporator. What happens when you take that high pressure liquid, okay, it's already rejected its heat, so it's still warm, but it's rejected its heat to the point to where it's a high pressure liquid now. It's ready to do some work. So it can't do work unless you reduce the pressure. So that high pressure liquid then goes through an automatic expansion valve or some other type of metering device on your particular vehicle, make, model, or commercial refrigeration or air conditioning system. Once it goes through that metering valve or metering device, that's the point at which it begins to lower its pressure and begins to evaporate. Whenever a liquid evaporates, it's boiling, and as it boils, you know yourself, anytime a liquid boils, it absorbs heat. Think about it like this. If you take a pot of water and set it on a stove at 211 degrees, you put your hand on top of it and it's hot, yes, but it's not super hot. You let it go to 212 degrees at atmospheric pressure and that 212 degree water begins boiling. Well, that evaporating or boiling liquid in that pan will absorb a phenomenal amount of heat from the surrounding air, and it'll be drawn to that temperature on top of the pot, and it will burn the devil out of your hand because it's absorbed so much heat. Obviously, you can't use hot water for refrigeration, but you can use refrigerant that will boil at a much lower temperature than 212 degrees. Well, that's what refrigerant is. 134, I don't know what the boiling temperature is. I know 12 and 22 and 500 and all that. I know those by heart, but not so much on the 134. But anyway, as it passes through that metering device and enters the evaporator, it's now beginning to boil. It flashes off a percentage right there at the metering device as it enters the tubes of the evaporator, and by boiling the rest of the way through that evaporator, it's absorbing heat from that air being blown across it by your cabin blower. Well, the result of having the air blown across it is that boiling refrigerant attracts the heat from that moving air, transfers it to the refrigerant. Then it passes through the outlet of the evaporator and transfers to the suction side of the compressor, where the compressor again begins the process of taking that low pressure vapor and compressing it into a high pressure vapor, sending it to the condenser to reject its heat and do the whole thing all over again. So if you have a system where the liquid leaving the condenser is not a full pipe full or tube full of liquid, your system's going to be low on charge. It's not going to do its work. If you have a system that doesn't have enough refrigerant in it to have anything at all, or a very little amount coming out of the evaporator or the suction line, it's not doing its full job because it's running out of refrigerant partially through that evaporator coil. So the heat going across it through the cabin blower is not being extracted. So your efficiency, or the ability for it to cool that air or to reject that heat or attract the heat, is dramatically lessened. So that's what we have here. We have a situation where it's dramatically lessened, but it's still working. So I do not believe the system is totally flat. And also the magnetic clutch pulls in and out. So that tells me it's cycling on the low pressure switch. The large line going to what's called an accumulator, that's a whole different story. But that large line right here is going to be a physical different size than the liquid line, and it takes a different fitting entirely. So that's, and conversely, it's actually a smaller fitting than the liquid line. So just pull your caps off and set them off to the side. But what I'm going to do is use a set of 134 gauges. 134 gauges. These are imperial. These are regular gauges that we use, on the job sites and everything. But they're equipped with a 1/4-inch flare fittings and all that. This actually has a check valve on the suction side. Well, on the charging line, the suction, and also the high pressure lines. So you pop these guys off, and you see pretty quickly that these are 1/4-inch flares. They're not going to fit these because these are a quick connect fitting. So you have to either exchange these hoses at the supply house for a set of automotive 134 hoses, or you have to come up with a series of adapters that'll make them work. And you can tell over the years I've had to adapt this guy, to where I can, I do different things with it like this. Use that to evacuate from and things like that. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and attach these hoses and see what's left in my circuit. Now, a lot of guys don't leave refrigerant in their hoses on their service trucks. I kind of like leaving refrigerant in my hoses because it keeps them from being contaminated. And also, when I pull them out of the truck, if I still have pressure in my gauges, I know that my hoses and my hose connections, my O-rings and all that stuff are still good. I haven't used this set of gauges. I think my son used them the last time, and it's probably been a year, and I still have pressure showing on these gauges. And I know these are exclusive 134 gauges, so I don't have to worry about cross-contamination from different refrigerants. But one thing that I do have to be concerned about is if I just open this up right now, even though I've got a check valve here, I've got a little shot of air that I'm getting ready to allow to enter the system. So what we're going to do, I'll show you what we'll do as soon as we get this hooked up. You have to pull this back like an air compressor quick connect and pop it on there. Now I've got system pressure, and I can feel there's pressure in there. I've got system pressure coming up into here, compressing that air up to this check valve that is open, and it's open all the way up to this part right here. But I've got that air somewhere in train, but we're going to purge that out, and I'll show you how to do that. Red is always a high pressure line, blue is always going to be the cold or the low pressure line. And this is the smaller fitting going on the larger hose, the larger fitting going on the smaller fitting. Now, I've got that air compressed somewhere and mixed inside this line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to purge, because these valves are all closed. This is my vacuum line, that doesn't matter. But I got the liquid, I got our discharge, I've got the suction, and I got the refrigerant charging closed. But I'm going to purge. Now I know I've got vapor refrigerant all the way to and through my gauge bar. Do the same thing over here. I've purged any air that was possibly entrained in here all the way up to this point. Once we hook up the refrigerant tank to the charging hose, we'll do exactly the same thing to make sure there's absolutely no air getting in the system. I'm showing about 72 pounds of static refrigerant pressure So I know that the system is not flat at all. It's just going to need topped off. Remember, this thing only holds about 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds at the very most. What I'm going to do is go ahead and dig out my jug of 134. We'll start this up and we'll see what happens to the circuit. Now, if my system was flat or had absolute no pressure or very little pressure in it, you wouldn't want to just top it off, because with it running that flat, if the compressor was to start up, which it probably will, on occasion we just start up, momentarily shut off, start up, momentarily shut off. And if the leak is on the suction side, like an O-ring or something on the suction side, every time that thing starts up, it's drawing a minuscule amount of air into the system. Well, if you draw air into the system, you're bringing in moisture too. So, you don't want to do that. That's why we go to all the trouble of purging all the hoses, so that we don't add that air into the system. Because air is a non-condensable. Air will compress, obviously, we have air compressors, but air is a non-condensable. There's nothing in it except for that little bit of moisture to condense out. So, if the system was completely flat, I wouldn't just be topping it off or just adding refrigerant to it. I'd go ahead and recover what remaining refrigerant was in there with the recovery machine, and then I'd be using a Robinair or a Little Richie or whatever vacuum pump, commercial vacuum pump that you have available, to draw it down to draw it for a number of hours all the way down into a vacuum, depending on how long the system has been open or whatever. Most of the time, anytime I work on a automotive air conditioning, which is not too often, thankfully, I'll let it run 24 hours. So it'll be tomorrow morning before I come back out to even do anything to it at all. But the fact that we just have to top off, I'm not concerned about it. And also, as you can tell, I've got a large commercial jug, 30-pound drum of R134. It's getting a little bit on the low side because my son works out of it and I work out of it. I think he bought this jug here the last time. We kind of share expenses every now and then. But at any rate, we're going to go ahead and start this up and see what's happening. One other point. If you do have a leak and you have a tendency to want to pump air in and out of an air compressor to pump the system up so you can pressure test with a spray of bubbles or soap, liquid soap or whatever, I would not suggest in any way, shape, or form using your air compressor and compressed air to pump it up and pressure test it, because what you're doing right there is adding a tremendous amount of moisture, humidity, so to speak, into that system. So unless you got a good vacuum pump like mine and intend on evacuating it for 24 hours, you're not going to get that air out of the system. You'll get the air out, but you will not remove all the moisture. So that's to me, that's not really a good thing to do. You always want to get you a nitrogen tank at the local HVAC supply house, a nitrogen regulator, and pressurize it with a controlled amount of nitrogen, which is an inert gas and does not contain the moisture that a compressor will have. You're asking for trouble if you leak test it with compressed air. And also, if you think about, you wonder about the theory, why do you put a vacuum pump on a system? Okay, remember we just talked about water a minute ago. Water boils at atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure is just what is being exerted on our body. If you could read that on a pressure gauge, 14.7 psi gauge, that's the atmospheric pressure, unless you're way up high in the mountains or below the sea. Then of course, that's a whole different story. But at any rate, water boils at atmospheric pressure at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what it is in centigrade, but at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Whenever you drop that atmospheric pressure into a vacuum and reduce that pressure, in this case around 29 inches, 29, I think 29.92 is just about as close as you can get to a perfect vacuum. Once you get to that point, you have to start reading the degree of vacuum with a micron gauge and then go from there. That's a whole different story. We're not going to go there. But if you draw it down to 29 inches of vacuum on your gauge and let it sit there for a number of hours, what you're doing, you're dropping it from atmospheric pressure to below atmospheric pressure. Once you get down in the 20s and 21, 22, 23, 4, 5 inches of vacuum, moisture or water will boil at whatever temperature, just about whatever temperature you've got. Like right now, it's roughly 80 degrees out here. I get her down to 22, 23 inches of vacuum, let it run at 29 for an hour or so. That moisture is coming out of this thing, because there's enough heat at that reduced pressure, below atmospheric pressure, to cause that water to boil inside that circuit and allow that vacuum pump to draw that vapor right out the discharge tube of the vacuum pump. So that's the whole thing in a nutshell. So let's go back to business, starting this thing up, see how low it really is, shoot some juice to it, see what happens. can see the magnetic clutch kick in and it drops out. You see it kick in and drops out. You can watch the high side do exactly the same thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to add vapor to the system because I have that capacity, and we're going to slowly watch the cycle last longer and longer as this pressure comes up in the circuit. So I've got the refrigerant tank on, and I've got the line purged up to here already like I showed you on the other two lines. So then I can open the refrigerant, so that's the charging port or the charging hose, and then I can open the suction side because we can't charge refrigerant with pressure in the refrigerant into the high side or the discharge side because the pressure in the tank cannot overcome the pressure that's in the circuit. So you always have to charge into the suction side of the circuit. It takes a lot longer to add refrigerant when you're charging vapor. On automotive, you can get by with adding liquid to the circuit because what happens, that liquid will dump into the suction line, and instead of going directly to the compressor, it goes through the accumulator. You notice we're experiencing longer run times before the compressor trips out. And put a digital thermometer in the discharge duct in the cabin. I'm going to simulate about a 35 or 40 mile an hour drive down the road and take a look at what happens to your pressure. There's my digital reader in there right now running about 40 or 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you notice whenever I increase the RPM of the engine, you notice a dramatic change in operating pressure. On a commercial or residential air conditioning system or refrigeration system, you have a fixed quantity of air passing across the evaporator and the condenser. This automobile has a varying amount of air going down the highway depending on the engine RPM and also the speed of the vehicle going down the highway and having the entering air coming in across the radiator and then across the condenser, which is typically in front of the radiator. That varying quantity of air is what causes the refrigerant pressure in the circuit to fluctuate. So what you have to do is you have to get it to where it's balanced to where you're satisfied with the temperatures being discharged inside, but also satisfied that the pressure while it's in operation running down the highway is not so high that it's going to create an overpressure situation within your circuit. I'm guessing we were probably half of the charge low. And I looked right here, I found on the tag right here where this one does hold 2.2 pounds. So this one was nearing a pound low in refrigerant, but I wished I would have weighed the tank before and after. That way I could verify it. A lot of times people might like to understand the basics of what happens inside a air conditioning or refrigeration circuit. Automotive is not my forte. I've never really done a lot of automotive air conditioning, just out of necessity with my own equipment and family members, of course. You know, so many variables, so many things that I'm not familiar with. But the basics is still there. You're transferring heat to the air that crosses across the evaporator or across the condenser. It does exactly the same thing. Another thing to bear in mind, when you're charging these things, you'll see a sweat line on your suction line coming back to your compressor. First off, you don't ever want to overcharge your system. Too much refrigerant is bad because you can enter an overpressure situation, but there is also a high pressure switch that'll cut it out but it'll cycle on that high pressure switch with too much refrigerant in. Eventually that thing is going to fail. If you take a look at your compressor as you're charging, if you notice that all of a sudden the whole back end of your compressor is completely covered in sweat, you can just about guarantee that you've got way too much refrigerant in the system. And that'll relate or be related in the higher head pressure or discharge pressure, you know, that you'll see on the red gauge. We also have a pressure temperature chart that we can actually look at the pressure on the gauges, and we know what temperature the refrigerant is at that particular point in the circuit. We can go into extreme detail, but again, there's no need to on this. This will have to just be a Cliff Notes version of just kind of topping off a charge on automotive air conditioning. Nothing more than Cliff Notes version, not a how-to. It's just the way I do it, the way I top them off. I'm just glad that it wasn't completely flat. I'm glad that it had at least half of a charge in it or thereabouts. This having been the first time this has ever been serviced since 2004, I'm actually quite tickled, and I'm not concerned about any kind of a massive leak or something that's just going to leak out the refrigerant overnight. I've worked on them before where you guys have filled up. Well, I put 3 cans in yesterday, and today it's not cooling. Put your gauges on, 0 psi. It's like, dude, you got a big old leak here. We got to find it. Once you find it, repair it, whatever it is, then you've got to go through the evacuation process. I'm glad we didn't have to go that far. Now, normal discharge air temperatures on a commercial piece of equipment, rooftop unit, split system, whatever, or even a residential split system, the optimum discharge air temperature is 55 degrees. That's what we always strive for. On automotive, that's a good temperature too, but chances are it's going to be just a little bit lower than that, probably 40, 45 degrees. And simply because we have the capacity with varying RPMs of the engine and also the airspeed going down the highway, rejecting that heat across the condenser coil, the radiator and the condenser coil. You have to remember one thing: the pressure and temperature of a refrigerant is directly proportionate. If you get rid of an X amount of heat, that pressure is going to be a specific amount. If it's colder going in for an extended period of time, the resultant refrigerant, as it goes through the evaporator coil, is going to be proportionally colder because the pressure and temperature of that refrigerant is lower. Like I said, Cliff Notes version, how to just kind of top it off. Most of you guys ain't going to have the gauges like I've got. You're going to have the cans. You go to O'Reilly or Walmart and buy with, if you're lucky, maybe it'll have a gauge on it and a fill hose. You have no idea what else is going on in the circuit. But keep an eye on the sweat line, and if it's already sweating and you got cold temperature, 45, 48 degrees coming out of it, I wouldn't add that other can. So you know what? This is Ragman 44, and I'm out of here, guys.